I'm speaking with James Foreman Jr., author of Locking Up Our Own. Your colleague, James Whitman, argues that the culture of America is deeply punitive, going way back. These are just many manifestations of this long-standing punitive impulse. It seems commonsensical to refer an issue like this to the police department, but it also seems like the American reflex is to turn to law and order as a response rather than something more sympathetic.
Well, that's exactly right. And I think you see this in all aspects of our politics and culture, not just in the criminal justice system. But so, for example, we're currently debating right now whether to, the Congress and the Senate are considering, and it seems likely that they will pass, who knows, something that would devastate and gut healthcare for poor people, for working people, for older people in this country, right? They want to destroy Medicaid, which is responsible for 49% of the births in this country. 67% of the people in nursing homes are paid for by Medicaid. That is just mean-spirited. And that kind of impulse, that notion that if you're struggling, if you're working class, if you're on the margins, we aren't going to do anything for you through government. What we're going to do is we're going to make life as easy and as good as possible for people at the top, and the rest be damned. That instinct, that's an aspect of the punitiveness, right, that Jim Whitman is talking about. And then it also plays itself out in the criminal justice system because, and you see these arguments all the time, whenever there's a discussion about whether we should provide better health care for prisoners or better education for people who are incarcerated, somebody turns around and says, well, I don't have health care. My higher education isn't funded. Why are you funding higher education for people who are incarcerated? To which I want to say, you're right. You don't have health care and you don't have higher education paid for. And those are problems. And as a society, we got to fix them. But because we're so mean-spirited in some of those other dimensions, then it almost becomes natural to become mean-spirited toward this class of people that we've, defined as the other and we've defined as despised.
One of the decisions that got us to this state of mass incarceration was the spread of mandatory minimums. And D.C. had a referendum on that. Could you tell us the story of the D.C. referendum on mandatory minimums?
Absolutely. And the mandatory minimums, I think we have to connect those to the related topic, which gets a little bit of less attention, but I try to connect it in a book, which is to the maximum. So the maximum available sentence is one issue, and then the mandatory minimum is another issue, and they're related. So in D.C., there was a move to revise the drug laws. They hadn't been updated since the 1930s and 1940s, and everybody agreed that they had aspects that needed to be fixed. They treated possession and sale the same way. They lumped lots of drugs together that should have been treated differently. So they needed to be reformed. But there was a push from African-American city council member by the name of John Ray and a retired police chief by the name of Bertel Jefferson, and him also African-American. And they pushed not just to rationalize the laws and update them, but to make them much, much tougher. And what they wanted to do was they wanted mandatory minimums, both for drug offenses and also for gun offenses, for possession of a gun during a crime, etc. And they wanted much longer maximums. And they got the maximums initially through the city council, and then they went back to the voters a year later, and they said to the voters, hey, your elected representatives didn't go far enough. They did not pass mandatory minimums, and they presented that issue to the voters. And in an era when crime was rising, heroin, as I mentioned before, was coming back again in the early 1980s, lots of people were scared. The left and progressives didn't have great answers. They weren't presenting great alternatives. The move from the left was just to say, well, don't do that. Mandatory minimums aren't a good thing. Treatment beds were underfunded. There was only one treatment bed for every 10 people who needed it at the time. And in such an era and in such a context, they were able to get the city's voters to pass mandatory minimum laws. And the important thing here to understand is that they passed in every part of the city and by a wide margin. So this was a city that was at the time over 60% African American, voting to impose mandatory minimum sentences that in the end would have devastating consequences for many in that same community.
And it's important to remember this is, this city, like much of the rest of the country, the primary victims of crime at this point were poor black people. They're the ones who are getting shot. They're the ones whose kids were dying of drug overdoses. So there's a definite desperation in the air, and people lurched after what seemed like a simple solution.
That's exactly right. That's a really nice summary of the situation. I mean, one of the things that I found when I went and did the research, a lot of the former council members have turned their papers over to various libraries and archives around the city. George Washington University has the fullest collection. And when you go and you read, and those papers include letters from citizens. And when you go and read letters from mostly African-American citizens to mostly African-American elected officials in the 70s and 80s, the pain and the anguish and the desperation really leaps off the pages. You see people writing and saying, I feel like a prisoner in my own home. I feel like a stranger on my own streets. I cannot walk my child to school because there are drug dealers doing sales on the corner, and I don't want my kid to see that. I can't leave him in the park after school because there's shooting in the park, and there's dirty syringes, and there's needles in the park. And over again, they say, you got to do something. You have to fix this. And here's the thing that I think is important to remember, and you mentioned this when you talked about who the victims were. The people who are passing these tougher laws come out of a history, right? These are African-American elected officials who remember when, for centuries, letters like that wouldn't even be written because there wasn't any sense in the black community that the mostly white elected officials were going to give anything, give a care, right, about those complaints. There's a long history of under-enforcement and under-protection in Black America, right? Southern sheriffs in cahoots with the Klan. They said, oh, this is not homicide. That's just another dead black person. And they didn't use the words black person, right? So that history of under-protection, now you have this generation of African-American elected officials coming into office in the 1970s and the 1980s, right? They're bound and determined to change that. They want to respond to those letter writers. So just as you said, grasping at solutions, right? This air of desperation, and in many cases turning towards kind of short-term fixes. In part, we have to also acknowledge they did ask for more structural reforms at the same time, right? They did also say, and I have example after example of this in the book, of elected officials saying, yeah, we need more police, we need more prosecutors, we might even need more prisons, but we also need better housing and an end to segregation and jobs brought back to the city and better schools and drug treatment. But for those things, they needed the federal government to respond, right? There they needed Congress. They needed Congress to pass a Marshall Plan for urban America, right, to reinvest in black communities the way we did in Europe after World War II. They needed Congress to pass national gun control. But Congress didn't care much about those African-American letter writers that I just told you about, and so they didn't do it. And so the people that I'm writing about in this story, I think it's fair to say they had an all-of-the-above strategy to fighting crime and violence. They wanted to do everything, but we got in our community one of the above, and the one of the above that we got was law enforcement.